The title of my talk is Aristotle on Goodness, alternative title 1, Aristotle on the Varieties of Goodness, and alternative title 2, Aristotle's Struggle with the Varieties of Goodness. So, dear colleagues, in the description of this gathering, Jan-Ivar Lindén has stressed Aristotle's relevance for contemporary attempts to overcome the long prevalent dualist conceptions in philosophy and in psychology. Positions that have stressed the distinction between the mental and the corporeal spheres of reality. And indeed, I think we have seen during this conference that Aristotle provides us ways of thinking about life which are illuminating for his strove to understand the psychic phenomena as the exercise of powers of living beings. So the concept of life is really central here. Aristotle's approach, one could say, is naturalistic, but neither reductive or eliminative as modern naturalist attempts or approaches tend to be. In this talk, I shall not focus on Aristotle's psychology, however, but on another topic which has been long dominated by a similar but still different dualism. This domain is that of values and of goodness. For a long tradition in modern philosophy, extending at least from David Hume via G.E. Moore to many modern meta-ethicists, has insisted on the gap or ontological separation between facts and values, or descriptive and normative statements or discourses, or of being and goodness. In relation to this dualism too, I think Aristotle may be made an illuminating discussion partner. For it seems, to me at least, that Aristotle's ethics is pursued in the same generously understood naturalistic framework as his philosophy of life is. For Aristotle, goodness and values are simply realities of life, basic facts and phenomena. Indeed, according to Aristotle, we can't even make sense of living creatures, in particular of their movement, without presuming things that are or are taken to be good in the sense of their striving or access. So for Aristotle, goodness is something immanent to life, not something external to it or something that it is imposed to the empirical world, as some modern philosophers have liked. The philosophy of life and the philosophy of the good are intrinsically interrelated in Aristotle's philosophical outlook. Now a word about my hand. It's in the same format as Piiras's, so it has a lot of texts which I will not all read, but I will refer to them and read some of them. And at the beginning I have a kind of disposition of theses under theta 1 to 8, which kind of capture some of the key ideas here in my talk. So that for a general and perhaps a bit ambitious framework for my talk. What I will now proceed to give you is something, let's say a segment of this broader thing. And I will focus on Aristotle's account on the varieties of goodness, which that is some accounts that are given in the first books of the Nicomachean and the Eudemian Ethics. For in those books, Aristotle insists against Plato's postulation of the idea of goodness, that goodness comes in varieties and is essentially, as he put it, said in many ways, indeed in as many ways as being. I will begin from Aristotle's philosophical method, which stresses the importance of the phenomena, and will then have a look at Aristotle's different observations on the different ways goodness is said. I will focus mainly on the Eudemian Ethics, because the section is slightly longer in that book, but we'll bring also material in from Nicomachean Ethics, the Metaphysics, and the Magna Morale. I close with some preliminary suggestions of how we might solve Aristotle's problem that he raises, that the varieties of goodness comes in different varieties, but does not constitute accidental variety. Concerning Aristotle's ethics, one point that I should stress right at the beginning is that Aristotle's ethics, which I think today is typically taken to be a paradigmatic case of virtue ethics, focuses explicitly and pronouncedly on the human good, the anthropinon agathon, or what good is for us, hemin agathon. Indeed, Aristotle's ethics in this sense bears a distinctly humanistic or anthropocentric phase. But what Aristotle has to say about the human good is by no means everything Aristotle has to say about goodness. Rather, his study on the virtues seems to build on, or at least it is prepared by, a more general discussion on the varieties of goodness. So let us now move to Aristotle. First, some observations on his philosophical method in the first books of the Ethics. A characteristic, and I think today rather well-known, trait of Aristotle's philosophical approach is that he devotes much attention to what is given to us, the phenomena, and insists that philosophical investigation should not proceed from abstract starting points. Okay, we have the second analytics, but let's forget about that. But that we must rather work our way towards such abstract starting points by starting from what is given to us. In the Eudemian Ethics 1.4, for example, Aristotle observes, and this will be the text number 4, that in the study of ethics, one should seek convince by means of rational arguments, using observed facts, phenomena, as evidences and examples. This reference to the phenomena, I take, should be understood in as broad sense as possible. Certainly it is not limited to what is given to us in sensory experience. No, it contains also what is referred to in the topics as endoxa, that is, opinions shared by all, the majority, the wise, or the most famous and distinguished of the wise. And importantly, and I should stress this for my presentation, it should also contain the ways we speak about the phenomena and articulate them in language, that is, the legomena. And what happens in these sections that I am speaking of is that we witness Aristotle using this, let's say, his method of working through the phenomena by criticizing one wise guy, namely Plato, in reference to how goodness is said in language. So this is one movement where Aristotle kind of chooses different pieces of endoxa and uses the language, the evidence of language or the linguistic data to refute Plato's position. So, in the introductory chapters of both his main ethical treatises, the Eudemian and Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle launched a devastating criticism against the Platonic postulation of the idea of the good and the associated, probably also academic, view of a common good. These two positions represent what we might call a Unitarian analysis of goodness, that is, views according to which all things that are good partake or share some common trait, be it an idea or some common feature that makes these all things good. Allegedly, they differ in that the idea of the good is meant to be separate from the individual cases of goodness, whereas the common good shared by all the cases may be a feature which is inherent to the cases. This is stated in Magna Moralia in one passage. So Aristotle provides a plethora of critical arguments against both views. The criticism contains in the Eudemian and in the Nicomachean Ethics, in the eighth chapter of the first book of the Eudemian Ethics and in the sixth of the Nicomachean are largely parallel. And I'm now mainly interested in one segment or strand of these arguments, that is those which are formulated in the reference to the varieties of goodness. So let us now have a look at text number 5, which is from the Eudemian Ethics. So I have divided it into two sections, and I will first read the first one and then discuss it a bit and proceed to the second. So, this is Aristotle. Good is said in many ways, in as many ways as being. For being, as has been distinguished elsewhere, signifies what something is, or quality, or quantity, or time, and in addition to these, passive or active change. And good is said in each of these modes. In substance we have reason and God. In quality, justice. In quantity, moderation. In time, opportunity. And in relation to change, teaching and being taught. Just as being is not anything one, including the things mentioned, neither is goodness. End of quote. In the Nicomachean Ethics 1.6, Aristotle adds a further explanation that goodness as a notion cannot be some common generality and unity koinonti kathologai en, for in this case it would not be set in all the categories, but in one alone. Arguably, Aristotle's point is this. Good, the agathon, is said in a proper sense in all the different categories. If there were one common goodness or an idea of good, this would bind the proper predication of goodness to the category into which this common good belongs. If this common goodness was, for example, the same as justice, all other predications of goodness, those of the mind, of opportunities, and of gods, to name Aristotle's own examples, would need to contain a reference to justice and would not belong to the category of quality, and would belong to the category of quality like justice. They would not, accordingly, be proper predications in their respective categories. Aristotle then approaches the phenomenon of the varieties goodness primarily in the framework of his theory of categories, the logical classification. We could say that this particular approach to how goodness is set is based on a classification of different kinds of predications, as is the basic idea of the theory of categories. This, however, is not the end of the story concerning how the varieties of goodness appear in our linguistic activities, according to Aristotle. For Aristotle quickly turns from logical criticism, given with reference to the categories, to the ways we establish and investigate goodness. And now I continue with the passage from Eudemian Ethics I just started. So he continues like this. This is the second paragraph of T5. Neither is there one science concerning being or goodness. Even goods that are set in a uniform manner, such as opportunity or moderation, are not investigated by a single science. Different sciences investigate different cases of opportunity and moderation. For example, concerning nutrition, the opportunity and moderation is examined by medicine and gymnastics. Concerning action in warfare by strategy. In this way, different sciences concern different realms of action. So hardly the good in itself is examined by a single science. This could be perhaps called the material approach to the varieties of goodness in contrast to the logical one I mentioned earlier. However, the material and categorical observations intersect. While one science may investigate goodness of several categories in some given realm of action, like strategy deals with goodness in the categories of time and quantity, as long as the realm of warfare is the branch which is concerned. The categories of goodness, however, do not determine what science investigates then materially. So we have this kind of two different criteria that overlap. The material perspective to goodness is contextually bound to the realm of activities in which one operates. The main point here is, of course, for Aristotle, that there is no one super science of goodness, so to say, insofar as we are talking about establishing whether something is good or not. So that would be the second dimension or Aristotle's second approach to the varieties of goodness. And now we come to a third, which I call the variation in the accounts or logoi of goodness. And we move from the Eudemian ethics to the Nicomachean ethics. In the Nicomachean ethics, Aristotle adds yet another observation to his criticism of the common good theory. He notes that even if we counterfactually or in our minds would confine our analysis of goodness to a narrow sense of being good in itself, auton agathon, which Aristotle considers one variety of goodness, there will still be no common good, not even in this narrow sense. And I read text number 8. But what sort of things are designated as good in themselves? Are they such that are pursued also when considered in isolation, like reasoning, seeing, and some pleasures and honors? For these, even when pursued for the sake of something else, would still be designated among things good in themselves. But if things good in themselves are like this, the same account of goodness ton takatou logon ton auton ought to be manifest in all of them, like the account of whiteness is in snow and in white lead paint. But the accounts of honor, reason, and pleasure are different and distinct, precisely insofar as their goodness is considered. Therefore, good is not some common something common according to one idea. One could say that Aristotle's end of quote. One could say that Aristotle's observations on the varieties of goodness in a way reach their culmination in the claim that precisely insofar as things such as honor, wisdom, and pleasure are goods, the accounts of their goodness are different and distinct, heteroi kai diapherales. That is, even though reasoning, seeing, and pleasure and honor are all things that are good in themselves, it is a different thing to say what is at stake in the goodness of each of them. Reasoning and seeing, for example, are activities, but activities of different psychic capacities. Pleasure is a felt quality, and honor is an achievement or merit quality bestowed to us by others. So things are different, and also the criteria of attributing goodness to each of these different things are different. That's what Aristotle, I think, means by saying that the logoi of goodness are different in all these cases. It is perhaps worth highlighting that in this passage Aristotle observed an important logical distinction between the attributions of goodness and the attributions of color terms. While the color terms are attributed in reference to the same account of color, irrespectively of what the subject of color is, the attributions of goodness are case-specific or object-specific. What it is to be white, in other words, remains constant, but what it is to be good depends on the context and what particular thing the goodness is attributed to. I want to stress this fact because this point was raised in 1950s by Peter Geach, who made the distinction between logically attributive and logically predicative adjectives, and claimed that goodness is logically attributive, and this very distinction is there in Aristotle. So Aristotle preceded Geach by some 2,200 years, but okay, Geach was much into Aristotle, so I think he may well have actually taken the distinction from Aristotle's work. Okay, let's now move on to the next variation. That would be variations in the grounds for goodness. And now we come back to the Eudemian Ethics. In the seventh book of the Eudemian Ethics, in a context that deals with friendship, Aristotle returns to the diversity of goodness, and again from a slightly different angle. In the passage that I'm now going to read, a distinction is made between what we might call proper predications of goodness and predications that contain a reference to some external feature like usefulness, serviceability, or pleasantness. So this is quotation text number 9. Because good things are good diversely, leonachos. For we say one thing to be good due to its being as it is, another due to its advantageousness and usefulness, to opheliman kai kresimon, and furthermore, some pleasure is simply pleasant and simply good, agathon haplos, whereas some is good in some respect and apparently good, todetini kai phenomenon agathon. Just as in the case of inanimate things, we may choose and love each from any of those reasons, so also in the case of human beings. So this prepares ground for his discussion of friendship, and we heard about that yesterday already. For we choose that one due to what he is and due to virtue. We choose that one because he is advantageous or useful, and that one because he is pleasant and due to pleasure. End of quote. So here, it seems to me, Aristotle identifies 4 different ways of giving reasons for a claim why something is good, or why we would have to choose or something rather than some other. Note that Aristotle observes explicitly, right at the beginning of this passage, that this variety is due to the fact that things are good diversely. That is, they are said in different ways. It is not that only those which are good due to what they are, which is the first case here, are good. Also advantageous, useful, and pleasant things are good. According to Aristotle, they are simply good in their own specific ways. I should probably note that in this passage, Aristotle also refers to this very, very central and important distinction between being good simply and being good for somebody and being good apparently. So another set of distinctions enters, and I think you are starting to be quite exhausted with all these distinctions that I have been extracting from Aristotle. And because of this, I thought that I will skip some of the further sets of taxonomies that we find in the Magna Moralia. Just quickly, I will note that in the book 1, chapter 2 of Magna Moralia, Aristotle adds a couple of cases. So this would be text 10. I'm not going to read it, but I'm just stating that he notes that dynames, powers or resources or potentialities, they constitute one group of goodness. and also acts as a fourth group in his fourfold taxonomy. Here, good as that which protects or produces goods. That would be sostikon tai poietikon agatu. So I think these are yet another kind of new sort of varieties of goodness in addition to those which we have encountered so far. So I'm going to now to proceed towards the kind of attempt to bring these all varieties of Aristotle together. And perhaps you now also understand why I said that one possible header for all this would be Aristotle's struggle with the varieties of goodness, because in many places in his works he seems to be very aware and think that this is very important and uses very different kind of points of view or criteria to divide goodness into different categories. Well, at least I hope to have shown that Aristotle not only acknowledged but also stressed the phenomenon of goodness, as he thought that it has considerable philosophical consequences against any Unitarian accounts of goodness, a la Plato or by the academics. Besides constituting part of Aristotle's refutation of the Platonic idea of good and the academic common good theory of goodness, the phenomenon implies, according to Aristotle, 1, that there is no common logical form for attributions of goodness, 2, that there is no single science of goodness, and 3, that goodness, that accounts of goodness, the logoi to agatu, are dependent on what kind of things goodness is attributed to. Aristotle's discussion is a fine example of dialectical discussion, which raises many aporias on various philosophical positions, and exemplifies his now putting much stress on the legomena against some given options by the wise or or generally accepted opinions. Of course, the next question is, what happens to the unity of goodness if Aristotle chops it up and fragments it to small pieces on many levels? What happens to the unity of goodness, which was a central thing for Plato, and I think is a central thing for many contemporary philosophers of goodness too? Well, the thing is that in the Eudemian ethics and in the Nicomachean ethics, Aristotle does not provide us a positive account on the unity of goodness. If anything, Aristotle seems to bypass the question, as in the latter parts of his ethical treatises, he consciously narrows his focus to the human good. He says that we will focus on the human good and leave all this other stuff for now. And because he is interested in the human good, he can, as it way, bypass this grander problem on the unity of goods. But Aristotle does provide us some clues, however. I want to close this talk with a short discussion of these clues. Coming back to Nicomachean Ethics 1.6, we find the following somewhat aporetic observations, and this is text number 13. I quote, "But how are things said to be good then? Good things do not resemble things that have a common name merely by chance. Is it then due to derivation from one single thing, in Greek to af henos einai, or does everything contribute to some single thing, in Greek pros hen hapanda syntelein? Or is it rather by analogy, kat analogia? That is, as sight is good in the body, so is understanding in the soul, and similarly in other things." And he actually adds to this, let me see, I have to, yeah. So he continues, but perhaps we have to leave these things for now, as explicating them belongs rather to another branch of philosophy. And then he goes to the human. Anyway, besides this passage with the three possibilities, another positive clue is provided by Aristotle's initial observation that the varieties of goodness are parallel to the varieties of being. This suggests that what Aristotle has to say about the varieties of being in many contexts may be applied to goodness. In particular, it might be tempting to apply Aristotle's so-called focal meaning analysis as provided in the metaphysics concerning being to the meaning pattern of goodness. This, in fact, is a path that has been pursued, for example, by Christopher Schiltz and some other philosophers. On this line, the goodness of substance might constitute a point of reference which is quietly presupposed in other attributions of goodness. The approach, however, is not without problems. The biggest one, as I see it, is that whereas in metaphysics the category of substance is prior in the sense that all other categories indicate features that belong to the substance, this does not seem to be the case with goodness, because goodness is as a kind of predicate applied to all the categories, but it's not a substantial thing in the same way as substance is. So I'm not going to continue with this part, but rather make a turn which is actually made by Aristotle too in Nicomachean Ethics. So another perspective is opened by extending the discussion from the, let's say, taxonomic or atemporal study of the varieties of goodness to the diachronic analysis of goodness in the context of life in general, and of goal-directed action of living beings. In some sense, this is what Aristotle does in the Nicomachean Ethics. For the very first instance of the word agathon that we encounter in the Nicomachean Ethics concerns goodness as the telos of our activities and strivings. And this is probably well known to you, text number 15, the first sentence of the Nicomachean Ethics. Every art and every investigation, and likewise every practical pursuit or undertaking, seems to aim at some good. Hence it has been well said that good is that at which all things aim. Another piece of endoxa here, it has been said, this of goodness. And I think that Aristotle would not accept this as a general definition of goodness because of the variety that he seems to stress so much. I think Aristotle is clear in the Ethics that not all goodness is divisible into the dichotomies such as good as goal, good as means, or intrinsic or instrumental goodness. But perhaps despite this, locating all these varieties of goodness in the broader framework of intentional action, of goal-directed striving, which includes, in the case of human beings at least, also the rational contemplation of means and the psychological dimension of needs, wants and desires, will help us to see how, after all, the fragmented varieties of goodness somehow hang together. So this would be a kind of very different approach towards the pros hen syntele, so that they are somehow related to one thing. So not to substantial goodness, but life in general. In other words, the one which all forms of goodness depend on or contribute to could well turn out to be life. This is a very speculative suggestion, I think, but it is, I think, in general, it's on the line with Aristotle's naturalistic approach to goodness. And I close this with this by returning to my initial suggestion that Aristotle's philosophy of goodness is best understood in the light of his philosophy of life. And if we do this, I think it turns out that this dichotomy between goodness and facts is actually something that should be incomprehensible. Thank you.